Today's class is on the taxonomy of wildcats. Take notes, there will be a test. This is a wildcat, so is this and this, but not this. Here's another kind of wildcat, and this is a wildcat. This is a wildcat? Ha! But today we're not studying furry wildcats, we're studying brass wildcats. Wildcats? Yes, that's what we call a certain type of cartridge, a Wildcat cartridge. What exactly is that? Well, it's not a standard factory production cartridge. You can't go into the store and buy a box of Federal, Remington, Winchester, Black Hills ammo in a Wildcat. So, why do you get a Wildcat? It's kind of like backyard shade tree mechanics. Folks who are good with tools and machines can make their own cartridges, and those cartridges are called Wildcats. You can start from scratch, but what most Wildcatters do is take an existing cartridge and modify it. And we're going to give you some examples today. Now, there are many Wildcatters, and they have been at it probably since the day that the first cartridge was actually invented, back in the 1850s or so. They just modify things. Here's a classic example. These two little guys right here. This one was the 22 Hornet. I think it came out by Winchester in 1932. And didn't take long and somebody came up with this version of it called the K Hornet. And all they did was straightened out that tapering sidewall, pushing the shoulder forward, sharpening that shoulder, and increasing the powder space. And they added several hundred feet per second of velocity to the 22 Hornet, shooting the same bullets. And that's what Wildcatters tried to do. Improve the performance of a cartridge. Now you can do this by making the bullets heavier so that they have more punch at close range, or you can make the bullets narrower and lighter so that they fly farther and faster, drop less, drift less in the wind. You can make it so that the cartridge fits a particular rifle, a really efficient short action, or stretch them out to fit a long action but give you more horsepower because you've increased the powder space. So let's look at some examples beside the Hornet and the K Hornet. Let's go to a classic, 30-06. This started a whole bunch of Wildcats. And you are not going to start with the classic 270 Winchester because Winchester itself came out with that and immediately made it a factory round. But anybody who saw that 30-06 started playing around with it. And one of the really quick early ones was the 25-06 Remington. Of course, it wasn't called the 25-06 Remington in those days. That wasn't until the mid-1960s that Remington actually made this a factory cartridge. Up until then, from the 1920s until the 1960s, it was a Wildcat. Neidner started that. Now, once again, I don't remember if his name is pronounced Neidner or Neidner. I think it's Neidner, but he was a Wildcatter who came up with all kinds of fun things, and the 25-06 was kind of his premiere. But look what else they did with it. They annexed it to the 28 caliber. Wildcatters were doing that long before Remington came out with it, and they called it the 280 Remington. And then another way to make a Wildcat is to take something like the 280 Remington and improve it along the lines of that little Hornet K Hornet thing we were looking at earlier by straightening out the taper in the sidewalls and pushing the shoulder forward, sharpening it to 40 degrees, and bingo, there are your classic P.O. Ackley improved cartridges. Now, some people will say that, well, the Ackleys aren't really a Wildcat. They're just the Ackley improved version of standard cartridges. So you can take a 30-06 and turn it into an Ackley 30-06. The same with a 270 or any other factory cartridge. But I consider them Wildcats because they're not an official factory approved cartridge. And that means SAMI has not approved them. And what SAMI does, that's the Shooting and Arms Associates Manufacturers Institute or something like that. But what they do is they certify everything for consistency so that all manufacturers can then make the ammunition and the rifles to the same specifications and tolerances so nobody blows anything up and all the ammo works in all the rifles. Wildcatters don't do that, but you can still get a custom rifle chambered for a Wildcat cartridge. all you have to do is get the dimensions of that Wildcat cartridge and then have a reamer made and then reloading dies to fit. And this is so commonly done if you go to most of the reloading die manufacturers and check their list of Wildcat cartridges. They will have an extensive list of them, so you can just buy your dies. Your gunsmith will be able to order the reamer to chamber it, so you're going to have a pretty quickly made Wildcat rifle. Now, if you're an experimenter yourself and you want to make a Wildcat, your game, anything's possible. A friend of mine, Bryce Towsley, made one out of the Remington Ultra Magnums. When those big, long Magnums came out, they had them in 30 and 7mm and 375, and they didn't hit Bryce's favorite, which was the 35 caliber. So he made a 35 caliber Remington Ultra Magnum Towsley. So he's got his own cartridge named after him now. He's a modern Wildcatter. Another of the really popular modern Wildcatters is Sherman up in North Idaho. He has an extensive line of cases that he's just tweaked. They're really not a lot different than some factory rounds, but he tweaks them for the ultimate precision for long-range shooting. Sherman cartridges, yes, 6mm, 6.5mm, 7mm, 30mm, 338s, short ones, long ones, just all kinds of them. So wildcatting has not died down at all, despite all the factory cartridges that we have now. A lot of folks will say really don't need to mess around anymore with Wildcats because there are so many factory cartridges, and I think I subscribe to this theory myself. They have just done such a great job of tweaking cartridges in official factory ammunition now that you don't really need to have a Wildcat. But there's just something about Americans especially. We like to make things. We're inventive. Good old Yankee ingenuity at work. And if you think you have a better idea, have at it. Just grab a case the way they did in the old days with the 30-06 and the shortened version of it, the 308. I mean, look what that one has all spawned. When the 308 Winchester came out, and that was a product of the U.S. military, the T-65 program, to come up with a replacement for the 30-06. That's where the 308 Winchester came from. Of course, that became the 7.62 NATO cartridge, but Winchester, which was involved in the search for that, when they came up with this, they decided to turn it loose as a commercial cartridge before the military even accepted it. But as soon as that 308 hit the streets, people started playing around with it. And one of the famous first ones was the 243 Winchester. Warren Page, Field and Stream gun and hunting writer, was playing around with that along with Fred Huntington. And I think they called it the Page Pooper. And then he had another one called the Super Pooper. I think that one was based on the 6mm. Well, that became the 6mm Remington. It was based on the 257 Roberts, neck down to 6mm. And that got the ball rolling. And I'm sure there were all sorts of folks around the country who were playing with different calibers on that 308. Then they came up with the 7mm 08. That didn't become a factory cartridge until, 1980, I believe. Took a long time. 260. Roughly the same time period, somewhere in the late 1970s, I think, they started finally making the 260 a commercial cartridge. Up until then, it was the 2608, I guess. And then the 338 version, that's now known as the 338 Federal. Back in the day, it was the 33808. So that's just a quick example how merely changing the neck size can make a Wildcat cartridge. But a lot of guys will also change the slope of the shoulder and any other things they can think of. One guy who was really innovative, name was Gibbs, Rocky Gibbs, and he lived up in North Idaho, quite near where I used to live years ago. And he had an entire line of Wildcat cartridges, or probably should call those proprietary cartridges, but you couldn't buy factory ammo, so there were Wildcats. But he took the 30-06 case and he made, I think he had a 24, a 25, a 26, 27, 28, 30, and 338 version, but he pushed the shoulder way forward and had a really short neck on them. And he also put a long tube that started at the primer flash hole and went forward so that he would ignite the powder at the front. Why would he do that? What that does is the flame then burns the powder right there by the bullet and starts the bullet down the bore while the rest of the powder is burning behind it, and then you're not pushing the weight of the powder itself, so you get more velocity out of that bullet. That was his idea. Didn't last very long. He found out it really didn't make that much difference, so they went back to the standards. But that's just an example of a really crazy wildcat. Now, I am going to put up for you guys a chart with names of some wildcatters starting way back in the turn of the 1900s. Well, you've got names you'll probably recognize some of these. Ned Roberts, 257 Roberts. Harvey Donaldson had one called the 219 Donaldson's Wasp. When I was a kid starting to reload in the late 60s, oh man, I thought that was the coolest name for a cartridge, the Wasp. Never did get myself one, but it's a 22 caliber. Then there was Colonel Townsend Whelan with the 35 Whalen. He also had the 375 Whalen and even the 416 Whalen. Those were all based off the 30-06. Grosvenor Watkins came up with the 220 Watkins Wilson Arrow. He was trying to get a really hot, fast, sort of like a 220 Swift cartridge, and I think he was playing around with something that became the 22 250, if I'm not mistaken, although Gebby is generally credited with the 22 250, and that is a great little example of a Wildcat cartridge that made a big splash long before it became a commercial cartridge. It was known as the 22 Varminter. They took the 250 Savage and they necked it down to 22. It's about all they did. They played around a little bit with the shoulder on it, but that, of course, took off once Remington released it in the 60s as the 22 250 Remington. I think it was 1969. That became just kind of the ultimate 22 centerfire for long-range shooting. And then the Ackley version of it, which I really like, merely, once again, straightened out the taper, flattened that shoulder to 40 degrees, didn't push it forward, though, so you can still shoot the original factory loads in the chambers of this version. And then you've got your brass flowing out to the new shape, and you can hand load it from there on out, and you've got yourself a little more oomph, maybe 100 feet per second in that cartridge. But that's a real simple Wildcat. So all of these guys on our list here came up with something, and so many of them did become factory cartridges. Gosh, you've got Fred Huntington with the RCBS dies. He started that company. He came up with the 243 Remington, along with that gentleman from Field and Stream, Warren Page. They were working on that together. There was Elmer Keith, Ken Clark, Charles Newton, the 22 Newton, the 30 Newton. He actually started his own rifle and ammunition manufacturing company, loading up those rounds. And then he built a lot of things for Savage too, like the 300 Savage cartridge and the 22 Savage Imp, the high power. Middlestead, Needner, Ackley, Dubiel, Kenny Jarrett. He's still active, and he has some really cool Wildcats. He has a 24 caliber in the 30-06 case, and he gets some incredible velocity out of that. He calls that one the Catbird. I mentioned Bryce Towsley with the 358 Ultra Mag Towsley, and then Sherman. I mentioned him with his various short and long Sherman Magnums, and there are a lot more. And then I've got a long list of more than 60 Wildcat cartridges, many of which you may have heard of, but you want to check that list. Just spend some time, go down that list and see if any of those might ring a bell for you. What could happen is if you're ever at a sale somewhere or in a gun shop and you see a strange chambering on a rifle, it could be a Wildcat, because what a lot of guys did was they would take a standard rifle and just rebarrel it or simply rechamber it to the Wildcat. And then, of course, you had to print on the barrel what it was, and they'll have some names that you might not recognize. So you'll have to do a little research. Google that, look it up, see if you can't figure out what that Wildcat was. If that doesn't work, you can, of course, cast the chamber. Any gunsmith can tell you about this, or just go to some place like Midway or Brownells and look for a casting kit. There's a material that you pour into the receiver, right down into the chamber of your barrel, and then when it cools, you pull it out and you can take measurements on it and figure out what it is. So you might find yourself a pretty cool rifle in a cartridge, Wildcat cartridge, that you might be able to buy dies for and start playing around and work up your own loads. It could be a lot of fun. So Wildcat cartridges, yeah, it's simply a homemade cartridge and then the homemade chamber to match to do something a little bit different from what the factory offers. And even though I think we've got factory cartridges that do anything and everything these days, I don't think the Wildcatters are going to quit. So if you have a crazy and wild Wildcat idea out there, or even if you've completed one, you might want to send in the information here, and if I find it to be intriguing, maybe we'll cover it on another episode of Ron Spomer Outdoors. So don't go too wild, watch out for those cougars, and we'll see you next time.